אחר צהריים טובים, שמי שלמה ברום וגם אני מה-INSS. אני אנהל את הפאנל הזה באנגלית, בגלל שיש בו תערובת של משתתפים. This time, in this conference, we decided to include in the framework of the conference 4 simulation games that will examine scenarios that are relevant to the reality, the unstable reality developing in the region. We included many of our foreign guests in these simulation games, and it certainly enriched our understanding and insights. We believe that simulation games of this kind are a useful instrument in dealing with an uncertain future. Some of the scenarios that we chose were very probable and some less. The simulations, the understanding from the simulation and the insights will be presented by some of the players in these games. Looking at the 4 simulation game, I can point at one general conclusion, which is my private conclusion. Most of the simulations reflected the fact that almost all the global and regional actors, including Israel, are having difficulties in adjusting to the swift and dramatic destabilizing changes in the Middle East. They are overwhelmed and paralyzed because of these changes. From my point of view, they try to stick with the status quo and react extremely cautiously and maybe even timidly. Sometimes it reminds me of a rabbit crossing a road that freezes when it sees the lights of an approaching car. That reaction, this attitude, which is the reality reflected in the simulation games, prevented the regional actors and the global actors from making good use of opportunities that are provided also with the new threats by these changes. To prevent interruption of the flow of presentations, I will present now all the 5 presenters. The first simulation will be presented by Sir John Jenkins, the Executive Director of IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. The second presentation will be done by Mark Eller, a senior fellow at INSS and editor of its main magazine. The third one will be presented by Ambassador James Jeffrey, a distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute and a veteran diplomat, including important posts at the Middle East. And the last one will be presented by Brigadier General Asaf Orion, also a senior fellow at INSS, and General John Allen. General Allen was the President's special envoy for the Global Coalition to counter ISIL, and now he is at the Brookings Institute. Sir Jenkins, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was Consul General in Jerusalem in 2004 when Yasser Arafat died, and I remember the scenes of chaos at the Makata the day of his funeral. So I suppose it's apt that I should be presenting this, the results of this particular simulation. So the scenario was Abu Mazen leaving his position, whichever way that might happen, as chairman of the Palestinian Authority. And it was a robust and detailed discussion of the consequences and the reactions of the regional actors, of Fatah, of Hamas, of Israel, of the United States, and so forth. So this is the opening scenario. Abu Mazen has gone. Thousands of Palestinians are demonstrating in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and there were calls from all sorts of quarters to release Marwan Barghouti. And there is no successor. And this is a fast-moving situation. So how are the different parties going to react? Especially when we get certain very worrying developments with a certain number of Palestinian casualties from clashes with the IDF and the abduction of 2 Israeli teenagers by Hamas through a tunnel across the border into Gaza, and a couple of rockets into northern Israel from Hezbollah. And of course, in these circumstances, a lot of different parties want to get involved. So these were how we saw the main dilemmas of the key actors. First of all, the Palestinian actors. Fatah, of course, is disunited. There is, in theory, a leadership in waiting, including Saab Erekat, but there's a number of different actors inside Fatah who themselves would want to use this opportunity to consolidate their own power. And they'll be looking at their rivals within Fatah and indeed across into Gaza towards Hamas. And Fatah, which has in many ways become moribund, needs to deal with this challenge from the street, the Palestinian street, and find a way to transfer power in some way, perhaps to a collective leadership, which satisfies the rhetorical aspirations of the Palestinian demonstrators, Palestinian people, but also maintains in some way the status quo, which benefits everybody. Hamas, of course, have an interest in promoting, maintaining their control in Gaza, but perhaps more importantly, using whatever is happening on the West Bank to upgrade their profile and spread their influence in the West Bank, which is something they've been trying to do over the last few years in a slightly covert way, but this gives them an opportunity to do it in a more overt way. The Arab states, who have been taken slightly by surprise by this and need this sort of disturbance like a collective hole in their head, particularly because their main threat remains Iran, of course need to respond. So the conclusion we came to that they would, as usual, call for more US and perhaps international involvement in this. There would undoubtedly be an emergency Arab summit with a call for a unified Arab position, something that, as we all know, is not easy to achieve in practice. They would need to manage their own public opinion, and for me this is quite an important point because there is such a thing as Arab public opinion, even in Saudi Arabia. If you look at what happened in Yemen, this was because of a response in some way to Saudi public opinion, and they would need to respond to what we imagined would be a surge of support for the Palestinians on social media and elsewhere. But equally, they do not want Hamas to benefit, generally. There may be one or two exceptions, Qatar, for example, but as a whole, they will want to keep Hamas in a subordinate position. Jordan, of course, wants to keep wants to maintain the security of its own borders. It'll have its own difficulty with Jordanians, particularly those of Palestinian origin, but they will need to sustain the control of their borders and internal security. And their first reaction will almost certainly be to reach out to the United States and others. There will also be sustained contacts with Israel. Egypt's main concern will be what happens in Gaza, and they themselves will want to ensure that Hamas are kept in their place, and that there is no overwhelming pressure to, for example, to open Rafah. So there's a set of evolving positions. Israel, in the view of the disturbances in the territories, mobilizes its reserves and responds in a limited way to Hezbollah provocation, but it also makes clear that there will be no direct talks with Hamas on this issue or release of Barghouti. something which is being sustained as a set of appeals from the Palestinian arena, wider Arab world, and indeed internationally. The US, and I think this will probably reflect also the EU position, will be absolutely clear that this is a Palestinian issue. John Kerry will be in sustained and regular touch with regional leaders and will say that Israel needs to act with restraint. Hamas will make some sort of attempt to exploit this by offering a prisoner deal. The Arab states, in the meantime, will be trying desperately to control unrest in social media and trying to support Fatah. I think one of the key insights for us, this is a situation which is fraught with risk for everybody. It's fraught with risk for Fatah, for those who would be the alternative Fatah leadership. It's fraught with risk for the Arab states. It's fraught with risk for Israel. It's fraught with risk for the international community as a whole. So I think what we're likely to see is a reversion to the mean, which essentially means trying to find a way to maintain a new sort of status quo with Abu Mazen's departure. And for a lot of Arab states, and indeed for the Palestinians, domestic considerations will remain paramount. The Arab states will want to control this, contain this, so they can continue to address what they think is the main threat, Iran, and so forth. And above all, the US will remain the central actor. I think everybody will seek US leadership of some sort of response to this. It was interesting that we didn't have actually in the simulation present two actors who are very significant in this. One is Iran and one is Russia. Iran in particular. I think the Iranian reaction to this would be extremely interesting. They would undoubtedly seek to exploit this, but how far they could do this without this running out of control would be difficult and would be a very interesting question. I think it's my time up. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Unlike the previous simulation, which dealt with a scenario which is more or less certain, as certain as anything can be in this part of the world, actually, sooner or later, one way or another, Abu Mazen will depart the scene. Our scenario is a little bit more imaginative. It discusses the hypothetical possibility of behind-the-scenes dialogue between Iran and Israel in the wake of the nuclear agreement. More specifically, the scenario we were assigned reads as follows. On Tuesday night in February 2015, in a meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the director of the National Security Council stated the following. The director of the Russian National Security Council contacted me through our regular channels and said there is reason to believe that a secret dialogue between Iran and Israel is possible, and Russia is proposing to assist setting up such a dialogue, believing it can help prevent unnecessary friction between Iran and Israel in Syria, and even contribute to the full and proper implementation of Iran's nuclear agreement with the world powers. He also said that all sides must focus on the battle against jihadist radicals and that he feels that such a dialogue could prove to be important to succeed in that battle. He further said that his Russian interlocutor stated that President Vladimir Putin greatly supports the idea and would be happy were Netanyahu to respond favorably. And the Prime Minister has called for a meeting of the Security Cabinet to discuss the proposal. Now, so, of course, the initial onus is on the Israeli government to respond here in this imaginative proposal. Others involved in the simulation include delegations ostensibly representing the United States, Russia, of course, Iran, Syria, the European Union. Some others were not involved for one reason or another, such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, although the anticipated positions or attitudes of those non-players in this instance, unlike in the previous scenario, were taken into account, particularly that of Saudi Arabia. Now, rather than keep you all in suspense, let me tell you immediately what the result of this game was. It didn't go anywhere. We were asked to think creatively and to be imaginative, but we were constrained enough by our understanding of reality to lead us to the conclusion that the calculations of the various parties involved prevented them from bringing this proposal to any kind of fruition. And the reasoning, by and large, was as follows. First of all, in the case of Israel, because it was not clear that the anticipated benefit, near-term benefit of responding positively to the initiative outweighed the anticipated costs. And the anticipated costs included objections by the United States, with which Israel consulted quite closely, and the anticipated response of some Sunni Arab powers, particularly Saudi Arabia, who were assumed to view this kind of initiative with quite a jaundiced eye. However, Israel also had no particular desire to alienate Russia, certainly not to cause President Putin to be unhappy, and therefore, because one doesn't want to make President Putin unhappy if it's not really necessary, so rather than respond negatively, Israel said it would like to pursue the idea a little bit further, and particularly to see if Russia could persuade the Iranians to provide some confidence-building measures, propose some confidence-building measures, in order to reassure Israel about their bona fides. Well, further exploration of this produced a strange kind of result in which it wasn't really clear whether the Iranians had authorized the Russians to go ahead with this proposal. In any case, they said that they were, in principle, interested in exploring issues, but they rejected both proxy negotiations, that is, negotiations on their behalf by anyone else, and direct negotiations. And so it wasn't clear what was left, apart from proxy negotiations and direct negotiations. And therefore, the Iranian position seemed to be that they were unwilling to commit themselves and certainly unable to overcome what they viewed was a suspicious Russian initiative. Why suspicious? Because they had come to the conclusion that the deconfliction arrangements between Israel and Russia in Syria had allowed Israel a free hand to attack Iranian or Iranian-supported targets in Iran without Russian interference. So we have, therefore, a strange situation in which there is an initiative, it doesn't go anywhere, we don't find out until after the game is over and we stop playing it that the Iranians had another position which was their real position. And the overall broad conclusions or insights from this exercise, well, at the macro level are twofold, I think. First of all, everybody lies. And second of all, everybody is suspicious of everybody else. The Americans were suspicious of the Israelis. They thought they might be going behind their back to do a deal with the Russians. The Iranians were suspicious of the Russians because they thought they might be going behind their backs to do a deal with Israel, and neither Iran nor Israel trusted each other, and it didn't go anywhere. So two main, if you would like to call them this, dignify them with the term insights, two main insights. Everybody lies, nobody trusts anybody. I think grosso modo, this provides at least a partial answer to the main question of the conference, which is about changes in the rules of the game. Some rules never change, haven't changed, and are unlikely to change in the future. But if we push that a little further, we do find some things that, to the extent that the positions taken by the players in the simulation reflect reality, may provide us with some possible guidelines for future behavior. First of all, there is never a simple dyadic relationship in this part of the world. There are always at least two, if not more, levels to any interaction. So in addition to the Israeli-Iranian interaction, and perhaps even more important than that, in this case there was an American-Israeli interaction overlain by some suspicion. One member of the American team was even raised the suspicion that the whole thing might be Israel trying to play the United States. And there was an Iranian-Russian interaction, also marked by considerable suspicion. And it was really impossible for Israel and Iran to move forward at all, assuming that they had an interest in doing so, without getting more coordination between Russia and the United States, which proved not to be possible in this case. Second insight I think we thought was worth pointing out is the Russians at least claim to have discovered that Israel was far more attentive to American concerns than they thought it would be. And they may have been forgiven for believing that because of media coverage in the last few months about how far the Israeli government had provoked the American government in the course of the negotiation of the Iran nuclear deal, but I think everyone understood quite well that the Israeli-American relationship still remains at the core of Israel's national security policy, and that's something I think that's worth taking forward as we go down the road. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. First, I'd like to thank General Brom for giving me the opportunity to participate in this cyber exercise, and I'd like to thank the other members of our team, which included a very strong Israeli contingent of people who really knew a lot more than I do about cyber. Let's go first to the scenario. You've all seen this scenario before, unfortunately, so I'll go forward to the next one. This is new. Note the 5 actors, and particularly the inclusion of Russia. We all thought that in the scenario that we're living in, or the reality we're living in 2015, 2016, they would have been added, whereas they weren't in real-life exercises of this sort that we've had to do in the near past. So, how did we respond to that? First, we came up with dilemmas we had to sort through, and then insights that would guide action. What we produced in the end is essentially a checklist for doing a crisis like this. The tensions between the U.S. and Israel are basically the same as in other military scenarios. That is, if we're not notified and we find out ourselves or you notify us later, we're not happy. Secondly, our normal response is to try to contain any crisis. And while that's our normal response and it's understandable, sometimes restraining crises is not the way to solve them or to emerge from them a victor. So the Israeli side was very concerned about that. And also, particularly, and this is a new thing that's specific with cyber, it's harder to prove who did it, of course. And you may have internal proof, but external proof, if you want to justify what you're doing, say in the UN, is a little bit more difficult. The next set of dilemmas in the best Clausewitzian fashion was to try to figure out what are the goals or the motivations, what are people trying to get out of this thing? What were the Iranians seeking? To send a warning to Israel, to start taking down Israel's infrastructure, to support Hezbollah, or to perhaps gain credence with Hezbollah to try to contain the conflict. These are all possible scenarios. What is the Israeli goal? What does Israel want to get out of any response to this, if a response? And What does the U.S. want to get out of this crisis? What are the U.S. interests beyond the normal knee-jerk, we want everybody to be happy and stop shooting at each other? So then we came to the insights. First of all, and there was total agreement on this, Israel has to respond in some way. We didn't get into whether that response would be in a traditional military way or using cyber. We actually did get into it, but we didn't think that that was worthy of putting it up, because either would be an option, and it would depend very much on very specific circumstances. The two purposes of retaliation, however, would be to renew or to establish deterrence, to show that if you strike Israel, Israel strikes back. And secondly, to degrade or attrit the military capabilities of the other side, because that's a good end in and of itself. So you would have to consider which you wanted to do before you took a final decision on the action. The final set of insights, again, if Israel did not respond, there would be a major blow to Israel's deterrence. Secondly, the response, however, should contain, in the sense of limit, any further escalation. Everybody saw how dangerous a scenario like this would be, combining both cyber and Iran. And finally, as always, Israel should consider the regional context. A couple of takeaways from this. Looking out at the audience, those of you who have military or strategic experience or training, which is probably 98% of you, will recognize this sort of format as a typical decision tree for any kind of crisis. My experiences on the American side of the telephone in 2006 during the Lebanon War and then the Al-Qaeda bombing were very similar to this, and we all went through a very similar process. So that's good, because rational planning is very important. But what's different with cyber? A couple of things. First of all, cyber is an extremely flexible weapon system. Think of it as a white circle and a black circle that comes together, creating a gray middle. On the white side, cyber is an activity stronger than a UN vote or a diplomatic démarche, but if it doesn't hurt anybody, it's hard to look at it as war. And that's a problem if you're trying to figure out how to respond to it, particularly to respond with military action. On the black side, it's not just a weapon of war, it's a weapon of mass destruction. If it goes after your electrical generation system and grid, if it goes after your banking system. And in the middle, which is where we were, it's basically like a weapon of war, because it inflicted casualties and took down hardware, but nonetheless was not anything extraordinary. So that was the first takeaway, how flexible cyber is and how difficult it is. The second one is, unlike in the reality of both of the crises I talked about, Lebanon 06 and Al-Qaeda 07, the American side, which I played, in looking at this, has to consider there's a threat to the United States in this, depending upon what we do. That's what cyber brings to the fight. It can strike us as well in a way that Hezbollah and the Syrians couldn't strike us in 06, 07. That had an impact on how we responded to Israeli requests. Thank you very much.
Okay, it was another fine morning in the INSS General Staff when ISIS on our borders scenario broke and we had our best friends with us. The opening scenario was that ISIS, first of all, took over Deraa and then committed a couple of attacks against IDF and against Jordan. The main dilemmas. Well, first of all, they attack us. This is something to consider. Second, they're too close for comfort for both of our borders, both the Israeli border and the Jordanian border. And their goal was to draw Israel into the struggle and thus drive a wedge into the heart of all of their many foes. What have we seen across the table? First of all, everybody's policy is against ISIS. Multiple parties. Not all of them mean it all the way through, but they all say it. Second, just as keen, everybody wants Israel out of it. Don't get in the way. We don't need you in. Third, everybody vocally or quietly says, well, you've got the right to protect yourself, to defend yourself by yourself, and everybody loves Jordan stability and Jordan security. That's a good opening moment for this assessment. Then, next best thing for Israel to do is to have the US at its back. So I did it the same in this presentation, to have our supreme allied brother with us. Please, John.
Being a supreme allied brother of Israel is a very good thing in my mind. The United States would view with grave concern the attack by the so-called Islamic State on Israel, because Israel's security and that of Jordan is a vital national interest of the United States. We have two things going for us in the short term as this crisis unfolds, and the first is that the region and the community of nations recognize that Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel does defend itself proactively and very effectively. And so that effort by Israel to defend itself would not come unexpectedly. And even because of the second factor, which is that ISIS is considered so odious a movement by the broad community of nations, Israel's need to defend itself a second time or a third time would be more broadly accepted than multiple attacks from a potential other threat. So we have a bit more time to react to this. But as General Orion said, we all believe that keeping Israel out of this fight is important for Israel's security. It's important to maintain the focus of the fight being on Daesh, and that's very important to us. So we would go, the United States would immediately go into closed consultation with Israel to see if, in addition to what Israel is doing immediately, is there any other support that we can provide to Israel. We would also go into closed consultation with Jordan with the same content in mind, and perhaps even in a trilateral manner, to see how the three of us, apart from the coalition, might be able to support Israel's retaliation and Israel's security, but also, very importantly, the defense of Jordan, because Daesh, in the end, wants to destabilize the Hashemite kingdom. Meanwhile, we would immediately begin to shift coalition air from targets in the north to the targets around Deraa, to begin to prosecute actively airstrikes and potentially other types of operations against Daesh forces to create some white space for decision and reaction. We would also consult, as I said, with the Jordanians about the potential that the U.S. put certain capabilities on a deployment order to be ready to move at a moment's notice to reinforce the kingdom should it request that reinforcement, with certain capabilities or certain kinds of forces to land in Jordan to provide additional support to Jordanian capacity. We would consult also with the Russians to ensure they understood how important Israel's security is to us and Jordan's stability. It should come as no surprise to the Russians, but we would also request that they leave this to us at this particular moment so that we can maintain a focus of effort. We don't end up having additional activity in and around Deraa, which can destabilize the situation. And as many of you know, there are rumors that the United States has provided significant support to the southern front. We would see how we might provide additional immediate support to the southern front to give it the capacity to push Daesh out and away from the area in and around Deraa to build white space in distance and time for, again, the security of our partners. And then we would talk with the broader Arab coalition. I believe that their sense is, given the evolution over the last several years of the quiet relationship of our Arab partners with Israel, the mutual understanding that the security of the one contributes to the security of the others and vice versa, we would reach out immediately to the Arab partners and ask that as Israel retaliates against Daesh in south or in the western portion of Syria, that they remain as mute as possible in the potential for public condemnation. We don't need that right now. We just need them to not say anything. If they have to say anything at all, that it be as muted as possible. And then remembering that we've had Arab aircraft flying over Syria and dropping on Daesh, we would immediately petition our Arab partners on behalf of Jordan's security to get back on our air tasking order within the coalition and help other coalition partners prosecute a real air campaign against Daesh at that particular moment.
So for the Israel response, do we do it now or later? Do we do it ourselves or leave it to others? Do we go after ISIS or the Axis in Iran? Do we maintain our policy in Syria, or is it a moment of change? And how do we deal with the nearest, nearer, and further parts of the threat? The big news on this piece is that most of those either-or questions should be answered with both. We do now and later. We do some and let others do the rest. Ashrei tzadikim, that blessed be the righteous. And we modulate our policy. How do we do that? First of all, stronger defenses. Second, we go personally after the perpetrators. That's kill them, hearts and minds. Shoot their hearts, then blow their mind. Then you let the others follow up. Actually, it should be a capability and willingness based. You could agree with many, but you need to modulate the exact response to prepare the next options for our leadership to take, and then to expand and diversify our coordination with the various parties. What the bottom lines are, well, rich potentials. Actually, Israel is shopping for who's going to hit the bad guys on its behalf. Second, there is an orchestration challenge. When you call in a Russian airstrike, you end up with other casualties than meant. It's better to prevent and respond. And last thing, as General Yadlin said yesterday, the Yarmouk Martyrs Brigade is already on our borders, so this is not really an imaginary scenario. Thank you very much.